usłyszeć. Zresztą tego się nie słucha, to się przeżywa. Tak przynajmniej nakazuje obowiązujący tu wszystkich rytuał.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. Please be seated. Gentlemen, I'm certain you had something special on your mind this fine Sunday morning. What is it you want to talk with me about?
Like, man, we come to talk to you about Jesus.
Good. Then you fellas are out witnessing for the Lord.
Witness? I ain't having no witnessing.
We don't quite understand.
Soul winning. Trying to bring people to Jesus so that they won't have to go to hell.
Well, that's heavy. Like our church is new, you dig? It's the new thing.
This Bible talks about a literal hell where sinners burn forever and forever. What do you fellas think about that?
You got to be putting me on.
No, we haven't.
Well, I have, and I can assure you that the Greek New Testament teaches a literal burning hell where sinners spend eternity if they're not saved. Gentlemen, I hate to be rude, but I've got a sermon to preach, and I've got quite a little preparing to do.
Oh, I'm sorry. We didn't know you were a preacher. If we had, we wouldn't have stopped by.
Amen to that.
Why don't we sing this song all together? Because I can't sing. That's why. Anyway, hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to episode number 11. I never thought I would get past flowers, but you asked for it, so I'm keeping it going. Today, we're going to be talking about the Rolling Stones' 6th studio album proper, their Satanic Majesties request, getting into a little devil music. Not really, but the title was a play on Her Britannic Majesty's request, which was printed inside every British passport. So it was technically a play on words. Yes, I do have the lenticular cover. I don't know how well you can see that. Maybe if I took it out of its plastic. Woo! Looky there. How cool is that? One of my favorite pieces of vinyl to own. Love that. Look at that. How cool. At one time they thought that the print that made this was destroyed. However, it was proven not to be true because for the anniversary, the 50th anniversary, which I will show you, I've got the 50th anniversary reproduction, they were able to more or less reproduce this lenticular cover. I think the original looks better, but anywho, let's get talking about this fascinating album, this polarizing album. If you ask Rolling Stones fans, either they love it or they hate it. You tend not to get people kind of in the middle. I don't know what to make of it, honestly. It's one of those albums that just perplexes me. I mean, I understand they were going for, the psychedelic masterpiece, sort of like the Beatles were going for with Sgt. Pepper. They were adding some new instruments to their musical palette. But nonetheless, I'm a huge Beatles fan, so I'm going to tell you, I don't think they pulled it off as successfully as the Beatles did, but I find it to be a very enjoyable album. I like the fact that it's so different. The way that it opens up, there's so many records like this where I can't imagine buying this album, putting it on the turntable, and then you hear and you're like, what? I thought I bought a Rolling Stones album. This doesn't sound like anything like the Rolling Stones. And the Rolling Stones had given us a lot of music that we didn't think sounded anything like the Rolling Stones in 1966 and 1967. And here we are, late 1967, and the Stones are still full of surprises. So before we deep dive, into this album, let's talk a little bit about what the hell was going on with the Stones. In December of 1967, this album came out December 8th, 1967. But what had been going on when we left our heroes? They were in some deep legal trouble that it seemed like they were going to need a lot of help and a lot of money to pull themselves out of. Mick and Keith had been busted with drugs. Brian Jones had been busted with cannabis. Woo! In his home.
Well, that's heavy.
And they were all in legal trouble. Brian Jones was getting elbowed out of the band, which is, interesting. Been reading a lot more up on this. And Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, in the early days of the Rolling Stones, he looked up to Brian Jones. Brian Jones was his idol because Brian Jones, he had the hair, he had the attitude, he had the sex appeal. Girls were throwing themselves at Brian Jones. Brian Jones had three illegitimate children by 3 different women before the Rolling Stones even made it big. I mean, he was living the rock and roll lifestyle. And Mick Jagger was very insecure. He came from a very middle class, kind of a conservative upbringing. He did not want anything to do with drugs. He wasn't a big drinker. And so when he saw Brian Jones indulging in all of it, Brian Jones had the attitude. Brian Jones at the beginning of the Rolling Stones was like, yes, we're going to do this. We're going to be successful. And the other Rolling Stones were like, we're not so sure. Mick Jagger at one point had thought about becoming an accountant. He didn't have a whole lot of confidence that the band was going to make it. But Brian Jones assured him he had the vision, he had the confidence that the Rolling Stones were going to break it big, and they did. But then Mick and Keith became a partnership. They started writing songs, and Brian Jones secretly, without telling the other Rolling Stones, started to take more of their royalties, more money per album. And when Mick and Keith found out, they were understandably pissed. So that was one of the kinks in the armor, one of the things that led to them taking Brian Jones down, as it were. And as we have seen from previous episodes, Brian Jones was falling out of favor, not only with the Stones, with the legal system, with his women. And so July of 1967, July 31st, the Rolling Stones' fortunes started to turn around. On July 31st, the appeals court overturned Keith Richards' conviction. Yay! And Mick Jagger had his sentence reduced to a conditional discharge. So they no longer had to fear serving a prison sentence. Brian Jones's trial took place in November 1967. He appealed his original prison sentence. He received a 1,000-pound fine, basically a slap on the wrist, and the judge basically told him, get yourself cleaned up, young man. You're supposed to be a role model. Get your shit together. And sent him on his way. And of course, very fortunately after that, Keith Richards became a crusader against drugs, a crusader against alcohol. He would go and he would speak to schools about the dangers of drug and alcohol. He completely abstained from drugs after that harrowing experience in early 1967, and he basically spent the rest of his life leading a clean lifestyle. Now, Brian Jones, not so much. Brian Jones, we know what happened there, and we'll get more into that as we progress through our episode. So, anyway, things were looking up for the Stones, and as a kind of thank you to their fans, the Rolling Stones in August of 1967 released a song called We Love You with the B-side Dandelion. In the U.S., the A-side was Dandelion and the B-side was We Love You, but We Love You was a love letter to their fans who had stood by them while they went through all the trials and tribulations resulting from their drug bust during the year. So the Rolling Stones spent much of the summer working on their next studio album. And by this point, the Rolling Stones were big shots, and they had entourages. And as Bill Wyman tells it, Keith Richards would show up with 8, 9, 10 people. Mick Jagger would show up with 8, 9, 10 people. Brian Jones would show up with a bunch of people, and they would have a party in the studio. Some days they would record a little bit, other days they wouldn't get anything done. Some days they wouldn't show up at all. It was just chaos. And eventually, Andrew Loog Oldham got fed up. He's like, I am not doing this anymore. And the Stones were like, screw you. You weren't there for us anyway, you big pansy. You fled to America when the crap was going down. So they parted ways as far as him producing their albums. And eventually, Andrew Loog Oldham got taken for a sucker by none other than Satan himself, Alan Klein. Alan Klein bamboozled Andrew Oldham. Andrew Oldham had set up Nanker Felge, which should sound familiar because that was the songwriting moniker that they used for group compositions. Well, Andrew Loog Oldham had set up Nanker Felge as a company where all of the royalties from Decca would go into this account. Well, Alan Klein set up a Nanker Felge account, Nanker Felge US, in the US, and had all of those royalties put in his account, basically absconded with all of the band's royalties right under Andrew Oldham's nose. Andrew Oldham got taken for a sucker, and Alan Klein muscled him out of the band, much like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were elbowing Brian Jones out. So Andrew Loog Oldham and the Stones were basically no longer a thing after 1967, and they got into bed with Alan Klein with very disastrous results. Alan Klein, to this day, even though he's dead, but Alan Klein owns all of the Rolling Stones masters and their music during this period of time. And yet, the Beatles fell for the same thing. But we're not going to get into that. I'm already spending too much time talking about this, the stuff surrounding this album. So anyway, what about this album? So anyway, it was released on December 8th, 1967. I think I said that before. And there were a couple of firsts. First album that the Rolling Stones produced themselves. First album to have a Bill Wyman composition, In Another Land. The first album that the track listing and the title were the same on both sides of the Atlantic. So a lot of reasons to get excited. So you put the album on the turntable and you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. It starts off with Let's Sing This All Together. The song is called Sing This All Together. But basically it's a lot of let's sing this all together and have peace and harmony, and won't things be beautiful, and we're all taking LSD and smoking pot, and woo!
What do you fellas think about that?
You gotta be putting me on.
That's basically the feel that you get from this song, and it sounds a little clumsy to me. The percussion on it is very haphazard. You've got stabs of brass here and there, piano, snatches. It just sounds very kind of thrown together to me. Not a huge fan. I mean, I like the fact that it's different, but it's not even in my top 100, maybe not even in my top 200 Rolling Stones favorite songs, but whatever. And like the Beatles did on Sgt. Pepper, and the Rolling Stones took a lot of crap because people said, well, this album is just derivative of Sgt. Pepper. You're just trying to do another Sgt. Pepper. And there's parts where that comparison fits, and then there's parts where that comparison does not fit. So one of the first spots where it does fit is you've got the opener, Sing This All Together, and it segues right into the next track, which is Citadel, which is, it sounds more like the Rolling Stones. That's the Rolling Stones that we're more accustomed to. And I like it. I think it's very cool. You kind of got that weird guitar riff, and then it breaks into a familiar Rolling Stones sounding song. You got those great harmonies from Keith Richards. You know, I think it works well. And then we've got the Bill Wyman composition, "In Another Land." It sounds like he's underwater, but anyway. So what happened here was, like Bill Wyman said, some days nobody would show up to the studios, or they show up and they'd be completely out of their minds on drugs, or they just be screwing around in the studio and nobody was in any condition to work. So anyway, Bill Wyman shows up to the studio one day and nobody else showed up. And he's like, God damn it. Nobody's here, drove all this way into the studio. And Glenn Johns, who was the engineer, was like, well, Bill, nobody else here. Do you have anything you want to record, anything you want to do? And Bill Wyman had been working on this tune, and it was basically just kind of an instrumental to that point that he called Acid in the Grass. And he said, I'll take a stab at it. So he recorded the song, and Glenn Johns showed it to Mick and Keith and Brian, like, look what your boy did. And they said, ooh, we actually kind of like this. It's kind of groovy. And so they included it on the album. And one of only a few, I don't know if there were many other Bill Wyman compositions, but I think it's okay. Considering the times, it's all right. It was actually released as a single, if you can believe that. It was released as a single before this album was actually released, December 2nd. 1967, and on the cover it says Bill Wyman's In Another Land. Like the other Rolling Stones were like, hey, don't get any weird ideas. This is not a Rolling Stones single. It's that guy's, in case this totally bombs, which it kind of did. So can you blame him? Not really. So anyway, cool song nonetheless. And then we've got 2000 Man, which if you're a Kiss fan, you already know they knocked it out of the park with their cover of it on the Dynasty album. Rolling Stones version is all right. I dig it. I'm acting like I'm kind of lukewarm with some of these songs, but they've grown on me over the years. I don't mind them so much. I think 2000 Man, it's a weird arrangement. You got kind of that acoustic intro, and it sounds very folky, and then in the chorus or the bridge, whatever you want to call it, they kind of get down to business, and it picks up in tempo a little bit and sounds more like a Stones song. Lyrics don't make too much sense. It's got some futuristic theme that I'm not going to go into. And then the last song on side one is Sing This All Together, See What Happens. Spoiler alert, if you haven't heard the song, nothing happens. This is sort of the audio equivalent to the Magical Mystery Tour movie. Like nothing happens, and I'm not a fan of this album. It goes on for 8 minutes and 36 seconds, and it really sounds like they invited a bunch of music students from primary school in and said, hey, you can have the run of the studio, put something together. It just sounds that pedestrian to me, and I know I'm going to get comments who saying, no, I think it's brilliant. I love it. I can't sit through it. I just can't. Originally, this album was going to be titled Cosmic Christmas because at the very end, you've got Bill Wyman. His voice is very slowed down. It's heavily processed. You can't even tell it's Bill Wyman or that somebody's singing, but he sings, we wish you a Merry Christmas. We wish you a Merry Christmas. And then at the very end, we hate you, which is sort of a counterpoint to the We Love You single. But nonetheless, that is side one. What'd you think? It's okay. It's interesting Stones. But moving on to side two for me, side two is what makes this album. We open up with She's a Rainbow, and you've got Nicky Hopkins' beautiful piano intro, and you've got strings arranged by John Paul Jones. Yeah, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin. He did the strings on this song. So I think that alone is very cool. It's got a great melody. I love it. You've got brass in there. It's just, the whole song is one of my favorite Rolling Stones moments. It's just brilliant. Then you've got the lantern, which points ahead. This album would have fit right at home on Beggar's Banquet. It's got that feel. It's almost like pointing in the direction, that grittier sound that the Rolling Stones would be going for, starting with Beggar's Banquet during the Jimmy Miller era. Then you've got Gopper. Gopper sounds, if I didn't know any better, and you told me this was an outtake from Pink Floyd's Piper at the Gates of Dawn, I would totally believe you. I'd be pissed at you because you lied to me. I would buy hook, line, and sinker this was an early Pink Floyd song. It just has that feel to it. So, of course, I like early Pink Floyd. I like the song. I think it's killer. Awesome. And then one of my favorite Rolling Stone songs of all time. This would definitely be top 20, and I'm not kidding. 2000, Light Years from Home. The second title with 2000 in it. What is going on? Are they seeing the future? Anyway, I love it with the Mellotron. You got Brian Jones playing the Mellotron on here, which makes the song. Apparently, Mick Jagger wrote this in Brixton Prison when he was serving his one-day sentence before he got released. And it's got that claustrophobic, paranoid feel to it. I just love it. It sounds spacey. It's futuristic. It's ominous. I love everything about it. It is very cool. The instrumental, FYI, was originally, the working title was Toffee Apple. Did you know that? Anyway, and then the final track on here is kind of interesting. It's On With The Show, where you've got Mick Jagger, who's kind of acting like he's, the MC of some sort of, cabaret act or something that's going on. I find it interesting. It's sort of quaint. Again, it sounds almost kind of like it was inspired by the Kinks or something like that. But anyway, an okay way to close out the album. It's no A Day in the Life, that's for sure. But anyway, what do I have by way? Well, I already told you I got one of the originals with the cool mesmerizing gatefold, the collage, and then the maze, which you can never find your way out of. And then also on vinyl, I've got, this is the anniversary, the 50th anniversary box set with the lenticular cover. And this thing is a beast, but I love it. I love it so much. I love it to death. So you've got this way, you've got a little booklet here, with pictures and essays, and then, woo, it opens up like this. You've got the CDs, and then you've got the vinyl that fits in the sleeves. You've got, this is, I don't know why they didn't do this with this elaborate for any of the other Rolling Stones albums, but it's got the album on CD in stereo and mono, and the vinyl the vinyl in stereo and mono. So it is a great set to own, particularly if you're a fan of that album. I don't have a cassette, but I do have the original CD that was released in 1986. Ooh, the cover looks a little different. They actually tried to reproduce the back cover, unlike some of the other Abco CDs. And then I've got the SACD version, which I'm bummed they didn't try to, replicate the lenticular cover. It's just got the regular static photograph, although the clouds are kind of trippy there. And then it opens up with a gatefold. You have the custom CD, and then you've got credits right there. So that is my collection of their Satanic Majesties request. Not a bad album overall. I like it. I listened to it more than you probably would expect me to, but I don't know. I'm kind of fond of it. I dig it a little bit. So anyway, that is my deep dive. Hope you've enjoyed it. Next time, we will see you for one of my favorite Rolling Stones album as we enter into the Jimmy Miller era for Beggar's Banquet. Take care.